All right, this is chapter 3 for Sociology 40, Gender Ideas, Interactions, and Institutions, second edition. Okay, so in the chapter they talk about bodies and the concept of sexual dimorphism. So this refers to typical differences in body type and behavior between males and females of a species. So the book introduces the concept of sexual dimorphism with some interesting examples from the animal world. So when it comes to humans and dimorphism, if you consider the range of sexual dimorphism among animals, this puts humans and our sex differences in a real perspective, right? So if you look at the extremes that are found in some species, the similarity between human males and females is actually quite impressive when you look at the animal world. So in humans, we assume that females and males are extremely different from each other. But when we take those differences in context of other species, however, the differences in humans are less extreme. So, for example, think about birds. If you're a nerd like me and you watch a lot of like David Attenborough documentary style television, then, I'm sure you've seen, like, if you've seen any of those ones where like a bird is dancing to entice a female bird, you notice that the male, it tends to be very different looking than the female, right? Sometimes they vary in size quite a bit. But like a peacock, for example, right? The male has this huge kind of fan of feathers that attracts the female, but the female is kind of drab, right? Just kind of looks like a brown bird. So it's interesting how their kind of sex characteristics of attracting mates actually have to do with a lot of difference, right? Like you can look at them and tell the difference, right? But think about humans, especially before we go through our secondary sex characteristics, meaning puberty. So before puberty, this is why it's so weird. Like people have babies. A baby looks neutral, right? And people have to gender these babies, as we'll speak about later. It's funny. It's like I have a friend of mine that her kid was born with like no hair. And she had to find these like little bows or barrettes or things to try to like clip onto her head or put over her head so that people wouldn't say, oh, what a cute little boy you have, right? And again, why does that matter? It's because we love to gender everything, right? And so people get super like, that's my little girl, that's not a boy, right? They get really upset and you're like, it's a baby. All it does is scream and crap. Like that's its job. It's pretty neutral at that point, right? But the idea is, obviously, once we hit puberty, we get secondary sex characteristics that further differentiate us, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit too. But, the idea, though, is that some species of males and females are just very different from the get-go in how they look, in what their roles are, all of those kind of things. So if you look at other species, examples that are in the chapter, right, like elephant seals or lions, and, anglerfish. That's something I put in your additional resources, this kind of comic about anglerfish that's like a little, maybe not academic, but it is comical as it is a comic. And basically it does kind of illustrate what the differences are with anglerfish and how that sexual dimorphism works within that species. Which is, of course, very different than humans. So, again, if you look at those examples, men and women are much more alike than pretty much any other animal in the world. So when we look at some research on sex differences and similarities, there's a study that they discussed in the book from Zell et al., right? And I say et al. Just meaning there was a bunch of other researchers, but it was led by this person. So they combined over 20,000 individual studies with more than 12 million people sampled on gender differences. And they looked specifically at gender differences in thoughts, feelings, behaviors, intellectual abilities, communication styles and skills, personality traits, measures of happiness and well-being, physical abilities, and more, right? So the results of the research study provide some statistical differences between men and women. However, the average difference on all traits included in the study fell into the small category. So what were the significant differences? Well, Zell and his colleagues noted that there were differences on 61% of characteristics, and the medium-sized differences included physical aggression and visual spatial abilities. And large differences appeared in physical ability, specifically throwing and sexual behavior such as masturbation and approval for casual sex. So what strikes you about these two categories of difference? Where do you think biology fits, and where might gender socialization be a factor? Right? So let's think about throwing, right? Oh, you throw like a girl. Well, how would that be potentially biological, or how could it be potentially gender socialization? Right? The fact that we encourage boys to be physical, we encourage them to participate in sports, it's almost kind of compulsory for men. Whereas for women, there is some acceptance to being in sports. That's definitely opened up in the last couple generations for sure. Like ever since Title IX, women had the accessibility. From that time period on, the last couple decades, there's been some opportunities for women. But again, it's not as normalized or compulsory as it is for men. Meaning, a lot of men played Little League or things like that as a kid, where not as many women do, or play softball or these kind of other things. So that would really account for differences in throwing, right? If you have just a larger proportion of males on average playing sports, then they're going to kind of develop those behaviors, right? Also, when you look at the kind of play that's normalized for men and women, right? Think about childhood play in a very gendered context. We assume men are playing in a more active role, and women tend to be playing with dolls or something in a more passive role. And this also applies to the medium-sized differences in physical aggression or visual spatial abilities, right? If men are encouraged to be physical and women are encouraged to not be physical, if men are encouraged to fight to solve problems and women are encouraged to talk to solve problems, that could be a result of the differences in physical aggression. When it comes to visual spatial abilities, right? If you're playing with dolls, you might be better at nurturing, but you're not going to be as good at visual spatial abilities. If you're playing with Legos and blocks or any sort of other building toy, you're going to have more visual spatial abilities. I mean, even like Roblox or something like that. So again, looking at the large differences, another one, having sexual behaviors be such a difference, meaning the frequency or likelihood of masturbation. Think about that as well. We live in a culture that demonizes female sexuality and encourages male sexuality. Male sexuality is considered, again, compulsory, just a thing that happens and exists. But for females, it's considered abhorrent or somehow an anomaly and not the regular, like that women somehow are just passive consumers of sex and don't have their own sex drive. And of course, women are more shamed for their bodies in our culture. So it makes sense that they might be less likely to masturbate or have less approval for casual sex because there's consequences socially for women for having casual sex, whereas for men, it's often rewarded, right? Also, it looks like I put insert figure 3.1 here as if I was going to insert figure 3.1. I guess you can do that yourself from your book, right? Because I did not do that. Okay, so looking at some of the definitions. In the chapter, they go through these different definitions of like, okay, so maybe sex differences are real, but what's the definition of that? So the first one was sex differences are real if we can measure them, right? So first in Zell's study, there was those observed differences, the findings from different studies and experiments, and all those different studies they put together to detect differences between men and women. But does seeing them make them real? Well, oftentimes, at least in as a person who teaches way too many research methods classes, I gotta tell you, like, it's not just about a single observed difference. It has to be replicable to be scientific, right? And then when we look at learned differences, we have to consider how learned differences are, a result of how we're raised in our sociocultural environment. And that can also produce some of those observed differences themselves. So there's some reasons to question research results, right? So people behave differently when they know they're being watched, the classic Hawthorne effect, right? People lie, especially about sex. And depending on how you do the research itself, priming can really manipulate subjects' test scores. So other results can shift, reverse, and disappear if we manipulate the conditions of the data collection itself. So some differences are simply a result of how we're treated, while some are quite obviously just norms for men and women that are unrelated to biology and more related to culture. So some of the difficulties determining the legitimacy of research results have to do with the research design. And of course, the social tendencies of humans, whether lying about sex is one of those. Okay, definition 2. Sex differences are real if they're observed on all or most contemporary and historical cultures. It's a long ass definition too, right? So if we could find universal differences, then we could think sex differences are real, right? So if we could find differences that were universal across countries and time periods, we would have a compelling reason to think that they're real. But since most research on sex differences uses only subjects from Western, educated, rich, and democratic societies, or weird societies, that finding a universal difference is not likely. When it comes to weird research, in fact, the majority of research on behavioral differences uses only subjects from Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic societies. So how might this itself provide a skewed picture of male and female sex differences? When we do research that compares across cultures, we discovered that our weird samples have resulted in unusual findings which actually don't stand up when you do research elsewhere. And when observed sex differences show variation over time and across cultures, it suggests they're not inevitable or universal, that they're tied to the time period and the culture. So when sex differences resist cultural influence, it might be a hint that they're not just related to gendered stereotypes or gendered opportunities, but it might be a part of being biologically human. So that's our next definition. Definition 3. Sex differences are real if they're biological. So our genes are our set of instructions for building and maintaining our bodies, right? And we have our genotype, which is our unique set of genes, and we have our phenotype, which is an observable set of physical and behavioral traits. When it comes to genes and gender, if our physical and behavioral traits are expressing difference that's shaped by our genes, that would make the difference biological. However, personality traits, emotional states, cognitive abilities, and physical potential don't necessarily have sex-specific genetic causes, right? So that kind of shoots down that definition. So moving on to definition 4, sex differences are real if they're biological and immutable. So first, when we hear about chromosomal differences, we hear about XX and XY. So individuals defined as genetically female carry XX chromosomes, and genetically male individuals carry XY chromosomes. And so an immutable sex difference would have a known biological cause and could not be easily overcome by social interventions. So the majority of sex differences that were documented by Zell would not qualify under this definition. While men and women are sexually dimorphic in that we reproduce sexually, and the process of making us reproductively male and female appears to lead to some average differences, on the spectrum of high to low sexual dimorphism, we're definitely on the low side. Plus, there's a lot of chromosomal myths, meaning people assume that because it's present in most men and absent in most women, that the Y chromosome is a source of sex differences, but it's not. The fact that most women have 2 X chromosomes and most men have only 1 seems to be a greater source of sex differences than the presence or absence of the Y chromosome. So genetic influences do contribute to some average physical differences between men and women and determine whether we develop ovaries or testes. However, sex chromosomes themselves, despite being one of the biological differences between the categories of male and female, don't seem to cause very many differences of interest. So, looking at the similarities between sexes, research results are sometimes shaped by the questions asked or the original hypothesis of the researcher. Again, I'm always being the research methods person, right? But it's true. It matters how you frame the research in what you then find. So if we're having an emphasis on difference, right, for centuries, the idea that women are inferior to men and therefore different has resulted in an emphasis on how men and women are different rather than how they might be alike. This emphasis makes one wonder what new information might be learned if we focused on our similarities. Also, there's the natural power of human culture. One of the things that makes us human, that makes us stand out from all these other animals, is the way we wrap ourselves in culture. By virtue of being cultural, we're also diverse. Take any 2 human societies and you'll find countless differences in their cultural practices and ideas. It's our biology that makes it possible for us to be culturally different from one another. And this nature-nurture debate is really discredited and flawed because both our biology and our socialization affect our differences and similarities. So it's not one or the other, it's actually both. Okay, moving on to biocultural interaction. So when we look at how people understand these relationships between nature and nurture, first you have the naturalism argument. So scholars from disciplines overwhelmingly reject naturalism, the idea that biology itself is independently responsible for our behaviors. Likewise, we also tend to reject culturalism, which is the idea that we become who we are strictly through learning and socialization. So really, the argument is for biocultural interaction. Since both our bodies and our minds interact with the physical and social world, we have to consider biocultural interaction, which is how our bodies respond to our cultural environment and vice versa. So biocultural interaction is how our bodies are going to interact with the cultural environment because we don't exist in a vacuum. Without both biology and culture, it's impossible to understand what it is to be human. So the book talks about this interesting phenomenon about parenting, culture, and biology, where if fathers are actively involved with their children, their bodies will respond in ways that help them become good dads. So here we're seeing that biocultural interaction at play. Okay, so another way of putting gender in context is through an intersectional lens. So biological differences can be muted by shared culture. While there are biological ways in which we are predisposed to be different, such differences may be muted by things that men and women share, such as nationality, religion, or occupations. So differences and similarities are filtered through our life experiences, right? So my experience of being the tallest kid in my class as a little girl conflicted with my socialized child mind about what women are, right? Women were supposed to be these tiny little dainty things. And I was like a foot taller than every boy. And I was put ahead. I can't even imagine if they would have kept me with kids my age. It would have been Attack of the 50-foot woman, you know? So obviously our own experiences then affect the way that we interpret or identify with those cultural notions of gender. So when it comes to intersectionality, this is the idea that gender is not an isolated social fact about us, but instead it intersects with our other identities, right? So this is what we mean by intersectionality. Maleness and femaleness result in us having different social locations in the world, and those locations intersect with other parts of social identity, such as social class, race, ethnicity, age, sexuality, disability status, like, and on and on and on. You can think of a million of these, right? And they all affect us because we're going to have different experiences based on where we are in those intersections. So for example, an experience as a very wealthy, white, able-bodied male is going to be very different than that of a, disabled, queer, black, poor woman, right? So obviously those intersections matter. We can't say all men this or all women that, because different categories of men are going to have different experiences. So like poor men are going to have different experiences than rich men, right? So any of these intersections, or, disabled men are going to have different experiences than able-bodied men, right? Or, queer men are going to have different experiences than, cisgendered heterosexual men. So, all of these things, these interactions are really what give us the meaning and the kind of complicated nature of how society actually interacts. Meaning we study gender as its own isolated phenomenon, but we don't just live as gender. It's not like today I'm my social class, tomorrow I'm my gender, the next day I'm my race, ethnicity. We're all those things at the same time. And so those things affect the way that people treat us, interact with us, and how we see the world. So again, sometimes men and women have more in common with each other than they do with others of their own sex. So the book uses the example of male and female coal miners who face unique challenges and experiences due to their work. So their bond of having those experiences in that same occupation connects them across the category of gender. So when it comes to human evolution, there's overwhelming evidence of human evolution, but not for the idea that men and women have evolved to be two different kinds of humans, or this, especially not this notion of opposite sex, as we kind of talked about before. So the gender binary, or this idea of opposite sex, characterizes men and women as opposite. It isn't reflected in science, and it fails to do justice to what we know about human biology and history. So the differences we do find are also shaped by life experiences that are not often all centrally about gender. Right? So think about it. What are some life experiences that might shape us that aren't about gender? It could be something as easy as riding a bike, right? Learning to drive a car, like, or even biological functions of like, we all experience getting sick, right? So many of these things are shared experiences. Like riding a bike, it's not a gendered activity. It can be things that are kind of more commonalities. So also, history discredits this opposites argument because our ancestors lived together in common environments with common goals and needs. Instead of being strictly biological, both men and women have always made sexual decisions in response to cultural rules. So there were and are strong evolutionary pressures towards sameness. But the social construction of gender, we can see how it operates over time, right? So the social constructions of gender among early humans were just as cross-culturally variable, historically changing, and ideologically jumbled as ours are. We tend to think of history as a straight line, as we project what we understand about the world today onto the past, but that's just simply not what it was, right? It's always been interesting and variable and different, and a lot of the sameness that we culturally get these days has a lot more to do with colonization than it does some biological shared sense of, sameness. So the gender binary might be an ideology, but there are real differences between men and women, right? Well, yeah, research on sex differences has detected more overlap than the gender binary would predict. And there may be ways in which we are different, absolutely. And in some cultures, those differences may be pronounced. But we also have the biological capacity to be very similar to each other.